Hi, this is Raphael. I'm the president of the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression, and this is Doris Liu. She's coming tomorrow to UBC to show her documentary In the Name of Confucius, which talks about the Confucius Institute.
Right. Hi, Raphael. Hi, everyone. I'm really appreciate you invited me to here and to screen this film on UBC campus. I actually filmed this documentary on UBC campus 6 years ago, so I'm really glad I came back again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to ask you what inspired you to do this documentary. Did you want to become a documentarian, and how did you get into the subject of the Confucius Institute in specific?
Yeah, I know. I never thought I would make a documentary in the first place. But before I made this documentary, I already started to do some independent journalism, basically on China-Canada relation and Chinese-Canadians, situations in basically Greater Toronto area. Mm-hmm. And of course, when I first heard of the closure of Confucius Institute at McMaster University, which is in Ontario, Hamilton, Ontario. That was in February 2013. I read the article from Globe and Mail, and that caught my interest immediately because, as I said, I'm interested in anything related to China and Canada-China relations. And of course, I myself, as a university teacher back to China, education has been very important to my whole life. Both my parents were teachers as well.
Did you already know of the Confucius Institute at that point, or? I
heard of the name, and interestingly, I recalled after that I once used Hanban's textbooks. Hanban is the organization under Education Ministry, oversees all Confucius Institutes. So I used Hanban textbooks to teach an American men who work inside China. So that was after I heard of the closure at McMaster University. I recalled back, I once had something to do with Confucius Institute, but I didn't know much more than Confucius Institute teaches Chinese language and culture, and that's all. But then why McMaster closed down its Confucius Institute? If this program is so good as it appears to be, why close it? The reason for McMaster to close that was Confucius Institute discriminate people who practice Falun Gong. Okay. And one of the McMaster Confucius Institute's Chinese instructors practiced the Falun Gong. Oh. Her name is Sonia Zhao, and
she's in the documentary.
Yes, she's my main character, and I read her story and the whole McMaster's event experience with the Confucius Institute on the Globe and Mail article, and I wanted to know more and find out more about Confucius Institute. So that was my starting point, and then of course I knew it would not be just a 2-minute short news piece. As the more I learned about the Confucius Institute, the more I think it should be a longer story, so which ended up to be a documentary.
I see. So the Confucius Institute, it seemed you say it's used as propaganda for the Communist Party, but it's called the Confucius Institute, right? Does it have any Confucianism in its in its classes, or is it just a cover up? The name is just a cover up for something else.
Confucius Institutes have nothing to do with Confucius himself or Confucianism teaching. That is actually also the own words of the Hanban's director, Ms. Shilin. Not exactly the words, but she admitted Confucius Institutes just teaches Chinese, like basic contemporary Chinese language and very basic conversational, like daily language you would use, and it would not go that far to teach Confucianism and Confucius, the whole philosophy or history behind that. So to put in some China experts' words, Confucius Institutes is more like a fast food chain of Chinese language learning. And I have been convinced that the Confucius Institutes are a propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist government. It's also in its own words, right?
Yeah, the director of the Confucius Institute says that in the documentary, in that
award ceremony.
In that award ceremony, it's an important part of our subtle power, right?
Yeah, Confucius Institutes was awarded by the government as the influencing the world. So the reason for Confucius Institute headquarters to be given that award, it was to influencing the whole world. And also Chinese Communist Party's propaganda chief said in 2007, while he was inspecting the Confucius Institute's headquarters, he said Confucius Institutes are an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup. Right. That was the direct translation, English translation of his Chinese words.
Right.
And that hasn't been changed.
Okay.
And actually not only hasn't been changed, but also during the past two conference of the Chinese Communist Party, like 19th and previously 18th Congress conference, the CCP's conference, they officially said they have to strengthen or advance the role of Confucius Institutes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And because it's mostly a language program, I was wondering how exactly do they insert propaganda into their language teaching?
Right. You know, you learn language from a textbook, and you also learn language from the Chinese teachers. The Chinese teachers are all I would say, handpicked by the Chinese government and trained by the Chinese government before they were sent to Canada or everywhere else.
Right.
And then during the Chinese instructors training, they are requested to not discuss any sensitive issues. Sensitive, I mean the issues that the Chinese government don't like
Tibet or Uyghurs,
Taiwan or human rights or Tiananmen massacres or the persecution against Falun Gong or Muslim now. Anything like that, you would not expect to be discussed.
They would just avoid it.
Yeah. So, and also that's the censorship part. But you were asking the propaganda part. And then in the textbooks, like I did some research as well as the Toronto parents while they were protesting the Toronto District School Board's Confucius Institutes back in 2014. Those parents did some research as well, and including Sonia Zhao. She herself did research of the textbooks Hanban used. They found a lot of propagandistic materials, such as the praise of the Chinese Communist Party, praise of the Communist Party's leader or the Chinese government, and some songs. Like my research would found, for example, Waterloo University, Confucius Institutes, while a few years back, while they were celebrating the Chinese New Year, the students sang a song that was basically incite hatred.
Oh, okay.
into the Chinese people against some so-called landlord, like 地主 in Chinese. That was the Chinese Communist Party's political campaigns. One of the campaigns, they dilute Chinese people's hatred towards certain group of Chinese people in order to basically persecute and eventually sometimes eliminate that group of people. So I found that's very, very disturbing and worrying.
Yeah.
And we even have a Canadian tenor who performed at the Chinese government's, the very famous Spring Festival Gala every once every year they would broadcast that Spring Festival Gala on TV, the China Central Television (CCTV), to hundreds of millions of people across the world, and that Canadian tenor sang at that gala a propagandistic songs. Basically says the Communist Party of China would conquer the whole world. Yeah. it's something like that, you know. He was later approached by U.S.-based media, asking him, "Did you really know what you sang in that gala?" He said, "No, it's just a famous Chinese opera."
The American guy.
American journalist called that Canadian tenor who was still in Beijing, asking him, "Did you know what you really sang in that event?" He said, "No, it's just a famous Chinese opera. It's sort of distorted, you know, Peking opera, right? But that song is the reformed format of Peking opera, because during the Cultural Revolution back into 1960s through 1970s, China experienced 10 years of so-called Cultural Revolution, where when the traditional Chinese cultures are banned, and the traditional Chinese scholars some of them are persecuted to take even suicide, because they're not only not valued but also persecuted, and also the traditional cultures are cut off, and the whole Chinese people were only allowed to sing 8 so-called sample Peking opera. One of the 8 Peking opera, so-called, was the one. So he said it's famous. Of course, it's famous. During that 10 years, the whole China was only allowed to sing 8 so-called Peking opera.
Right. So they basically insert propaganda into things that they would present as art or as language learning.
Like Chinese calligraphy, right? What you write down may contain. Right, and you watch a Chinese movie, and China produced a lot of the very so-called, in their words is like positive energy, positive movies. Positive means to cast a positive light on the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party. So you watch a movie during the China Film Week. Maybe one of the films are the in Chinese, people would describe it as red film, red movie, or red song. You don't know that because your lack of the cultural or societal background of that piece of information. So it's very easy for the Western students, even some adults, to, I would say, to learn those propaganda from the materials. I'm not saying every material that you learn from Confucius Institutes contain that, but once in a while there must be something sneaked into the textbooks, teaching materials, and in the Chinese instructors' their brain. They are taught, like myself. I was born and graduated in Chinese universities, and I was educated like that. Before I was open to free information, I didn't know what else exists other than.
So did you have a cultural shock when you came to
sort
Canada?
of? But before that, I was lucky because after I worked for the university, I left the university and worked for an American company. So we had a fiber connection from a Chinese city from our office to the American city, and that was the early years when the Chinese government started to build the internet and started to build internet blockage, like Great Wall, the Great Firewall. That So that was a very early stage. So
when it started blocking,
I was lucky to not experience that censorship during that direct fiber connection. So that was the very first window for me to know the free information. That was really shocked when I first saw the bloody image of the Tiananmen massacre event. The tanks roll over the young student bodies like just like in your age. That was really shocked to me to watch, to see those imagery and to read those articles, to watch some documentaries, and also as well as the persecution against the Falun Gong. But yeah, so those information was really shocked. But that was that happened before I immigrated to Canada. That was actually the reason why I decided to leave China and go to a free country.
Right.
Yeah.
During the documentary, one of the members from the TDSB, the Toronto District School Board, he argued that if they are to separate from the Confucius Institute because China discriminates against minorities, then why don't they also stop using materials from the USA because they might disagree with the Iraq War? What do you think of that argument?
I think every country may have its so-called, if you wish, black history. Like here in Canada, we once like treat badly the indigenous people, right?
Right.
And American too, they treat their indigenous people and Indian people once badly, or some other, like they treat Chinese immigrant badly as well during their history, and here too. But the differences, I think, between these Western countries and the Chinese government is we recognize that, and we admit the mistakes or even very bad wrongs we did, and even human rights violations and persecutions we once did. And we didn't shy to tell and educate our students and the whole society to realize, to know what happened before the black history. We didn't try to hide that, cover up. And then even more so, I think here, like the Chinese, the discrimination once against the Chinese community, the head tax, or China Exclusion Act. Like I remember, it was during Stephen Harper's government. They recognize that, and they allocate certain amount of money to the Chinese community, to establish some educational program to teach people that. So that's it. But what happened in China? The Chinese government has been doing political campaigns one after another, never stopped.
Right.
And the group of people, Chinese people who have been persecuted and targeted, have been enormous. The number, I mean. But we never ever heard about Chinese government, the Communist Party government, apologize. Yeah. And they always cover up. And that is why they need to first censor certain information, second, propaganda, to try to put some so-called positive images. The positive, I would say it's the positive light image of the Chinese government, which is not positive at all. So it's very different. If you work with government or regime like the Chinese government, who doesn't value human rights, freedom, democracy, rule of law, who doesn't play the game by the rules, how do you expect what will come up next? This time they can cheat you and they say, oh, sorry, we correct, and next time they cheated you again. There's no rules for them. Yeah. I think that's fundamentally the differences.
Right. So basically you only get one side of the story, whereas with anything United States related, you also always hear both sides.
Yeah, because we have freedom of press,
right,
freedom of speech, and especially in universities, every aspects are allowed to be expressed. But that's not the case inside China. And now, through the Confucius Institutes, the Chinese government is trying to export its propaganda and censorship outside of Chinese border.
Okay.
So that's what I concerned very much.
So we were talking on the way here about how UBC rejected the Confucius Institute 4 times already.
Right.
What do you think is the reason why they were rejected?
I believe, and also back in 2014, I interviewed Professor Ross King, who was at the time head of East Asia language, if I remember right.
He's currently the head of the Department of Asian
He
Studies.
is still,
Yeah.
okay. So Professor King told me they found the Confucius Institute came with strings. That's his own words, strings.
Yeah.
Meaning it's unconditional. It's not unconditional. The condition coming with Confucius Institutes was you're not allowed to talk about those sensitive issues, Tibet, Taiwan, Falun Gong, or Tiananmen, whatever concerns the Chinese government. And also the agreement between UBC and the Chinese government representative, which is the Hanban, is not free for public scrutiny. It has a confidential clause in the agreement.
Right.
So that's also one of the concerns that UBC back then the president think it's not appropriate to enter that program, the partnership. So, but I have an impression after that interview that the Chinese government is trying to, by any means it could, to push a Confucius Institute to UBC, which is the top 3 universities, one of the top 3 universities.
So are they trying to compromise somewhat, or?
They're trying to get its Confucius Institute into or onto UBC's campus.
Right.
Because during the 4 times, they tried with different angles. Like first time, maybe it was the Chinese government approached the UBC through one department and it failed. And then a few years later, Hanban tried from different departments or schools of UBC, trying to have that school to host Confucius Institutes. And it failed again. I didn't know the second time when was that. But the third time it came back again with different a third department or schools of UBC's faculties. So it kept trying because the Chinese government realized, and it knows, end of the day, it is the certain individuals who is in charge of that decision making, would make that decision whether or not they will have a Confucius Institute on campus. So they keep trying because you will change it. You will have new president of UBC a few years later. So maybe we can expect the 5th approach from the Chinese government.
Yeah.
And we don't know what happened next.
Do you think they'll keep trying
I think so.
indefinitely?
But now it became very difficult for the Chinese government to establish new Confucius Institutes in Canada after the McMaster University's closure, because the controversies surrounding the Confucius Institutes has been increasing, not decreasing, and there have been more universities across the world to close Confucius Institute.
Right.
Comparing to the speed of opening new Confucius Institutes.
Okay. So do you think it's, on a big picture level, do you think it's going down, or is it still stable?
In Canada, I believe, as well as in the United States, the number of Confucius Institutes is going down already. Okay. Especially, like here, in Canada, we have the first closure in 2013, and the second is 2014 TDSB. And third, it was the New Brunswick provincial government. That partnership was forged between the Canadian provincial government and the Chinese government. And the education minister of New Brunswick said last year very firmly he wanted the Confucius Institute in his province to be closed.
Okay.
But because of the agreement, it could only partially close that Confucius Institutes, meaning they closed already the Confucius Institute operation in 8 high schools already. And then they will, by the end of the agreement term, which would be 2022, the province will close eventually the remaining operation of the Confucius Institutes in some remaining schools.
Okay.
So that's.
Do you think it'll die out completely in North America eventually, or are some gonna be always there?
This is hard to say, but maybe there will be a day the Confucius Institutes will disappear completely. Maybe, but it takes a long time, I think, because we like we said, from 2013 to now, 7 years, almost 7 years. 7 years passed. We have here in Canada, we have, let's say, 2.5. Oh no, 3. Here, BCIT was the first Confucius Institute in Canada, right? I was just told by a CBC reporter yesterday, said BCIT's Confucius Institute was completely closed last summer.
Okay.
So then we say 3.5 is closed. And in the United States, in our southern neighbor, the number of Confucius Institutes came down from its peak, which is 110 in 2017, and now the number became around 80. So it's 30 now Confucius Institutes closed just during 2 or 3 years. So, and also in Europe, we see Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, Germany. I believe this year there will also be a German university close Confucius Institute. So the closures happened basically in North America and Europe. I've never heard of closure in Asia, Africa, or South,
Australia as well, isn't it, right?
Australia, yes, Australia's provincial government too. I think it's a state. They call states, we call province. I think it's Victoria State. They have 13 Confucius classroom, which conforms Confucius classroom, which is a lower level of Confucius Institute. The classroom program runs at high school or middle primary school. So in Australia, right? You reminded me. So, and also in the United States, the American government has passed laws to basically force the American universities and colleges to choose the funding for their Chinese language program either from its own government or from Confucius Institutes. That means if you have a Confucius Institute on campus, you cannot get money from your own government. No, so that was very effective, actually.
Yeah.
After that law has passed, there have been more than 20 universities in America close the Confucius Institute. Very effective.
That was definitely effective. So the documentary talks about the Confucius Institute and how it can limit academic freedom and how it promotes discrimination of groups like the Falun Gong. But I was wondering if you think that the Confucius Institute has been or is being used as espionage. Do they have spies and they're giving them information, providing information to the Chinese government? Right. I think... or is that just a conspiracy theory?
I don't think that's just conspiracy theory. Because as you look at our own intelligence agent, which is Canada Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS in short, CSIS has watching the development of Confucius Institute in Canada as early as it's very like 2004 or 2005, and CSIS already said, even that early, CSIS already said the Confucius Institutes are China's soft power. Back then, that was soft power, which means through Confucius Institutes, China wants to gain the Western's hearts and minds, which including recruiting sympathetic Canadians to work on the behalf of Chinese government. And also a few years later, in 2013, CSIS put up a report on China. One of the chapters in that report was about Confucius Institutes. In that chapter, CSIS listed out all the threats Confucius Institutes posed to Canadian society and education community. One of them is CSIS spying on first group, the Chinese diaspora on campus or in that community. And they got a Chinese student telling them the Chinese student himself or herself was watched by the Confucius Institute staff. And of course, because of the Confucius Institute's physically located on the university campus, it's very convenient for the Chinese staff there or for anyone connected to the Chinese government through Confucius Institute to get some confidential information or secrets or even research secrets. And recently, just a few months earlier, Belgium exclude Confucius Institute Chinese director, who is a professor at a famous Chinese university in Beijing. On the ground, that Chinese professor, has been doing espionage on behalf of Chinese government. That was the very first concrete reports about a Chinese Confucius Institute instructor or director or staff has been charged, or not charged, but alleged as spies. And I don't think...
It's like a way to get their foot in the door, right?
Yeah. It's just like in the United States, recently I read an article, the U.S. Senate, one of the committee at the Senate, they had a report last year which basically look into the universities in America where they have cooperations with foreign governments, to look at the universities, their interaction with the foreign governments, especially China, such countries which do not share the same values as we do. So China included Russia and Iran, those countries. And Confucius Institute has been one of the big concerns in that Senate report. In their words, it says the universities or academia community has been a black hole where the American government hasn't been looking into the interactions between its own universities and the foreign governments. So I believe the situation here in Canada is more or less the same. So it's like a loophole here in the academia community or educational institutions should be looked at.
Yeah, it's a breach, right?
Yeah, because it's between because you're working with the government. Like I said, it's not a government values those principles. So you got to be extra cautious to that partnership.
Okay. Yeah, and speaking of the documentary, talking about confronting the Confucius Institute from the angles of academic freedom and discrimination, you chose to focus a lot more on the discrimination aspect, especially on the Falun Gong. Was there any particular reason for this?
I think first, the very first closure, which is a McMaster closure, university's closure, was directly due to this discriminatory hiring policies against the Falun Gong. And second, back then, it was the only character I could find, like Sonia Jia, because Sonia Jia was the very first and only character I could find who can participate in
who was outspoken against.
Outspoken against. And I couldn't find any other characters like her. Of course, I wanted to find more to share different perspectives.
Right.
So that was directly the reasons. I had to start from somewhere to tell the story, and that was the starting point. And then now, as I finished this film and showing the film around the world, I have met many direct representatives of the Confucius Institute in some other countries as well. So I found out this discrimination against the Falun Gong is the non-disputable fatal flaw.
Right.
I would put in that words.
Okay.
You cannot. There's no way you argue with that.
It's not defensible. Yeah.
It's not defensible because even last year, I was convinced by a Confucius Institute in Germany that the Chinese government is still practicing that discrimination clause in hiring contracts. Anyone who would work with the Confucius Institute, any Chinese, I mean, of course, it's not applied to foreigners. So I was told by different sources, the people who are sent to a foreign country by the Chinese government under the governmental, like official governmental mandate, they have to sign some sorts of hiring contract or whatever discipline, documents. On those documents, there will be a line. No Falun Gong discrimination. So to me, I think that's something you cannot defend on. Even though someone said those Chinese instructors are hired by the Chinese government in China, it's not happening. The hiring process is not happening in Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
But those Chinese instructors are working in Canada. They're not working.
And Canada has no say on it either, right?
No say on that either. You can have a say, oh, it's not the Chinese instructor sent by the Chinese government qualified or not qualified teaching. But you don't know it. Whoever are sent to your campus have already been screened. Like if there were not be Sonia, we would not know that secrets at all.
Yeah. She somehow managed to pass the filter.
She basically lied to herself. She had to lie. If you watch my documentary, right? 3 days before she was sent to Canada, she was asked to sign a contract, and the consequences of not signing the contract would be...
She was already too far in, and then she would be taken to jail, I imagine, if they found out she was Falun Gong.
Yeah. And if she would not sign the contract, she was very easily to find out to be a Falun Gong practitioner. And that's very dangerous in China.
I see. Have you faced any threats or personal, professional consequences during or after making this film? I remember there were 2 interviews at least in the movie where they end a little aggressively. They kind of kick you out, and they also ask you to delete the footage, but then they already signed the contract. Right. And also from the Chinese government, did you receive any...
directly from the Chinese government towards me, myself, there's none directly, but very interesting. I can share a lot of stories, even while and after, and I make the documentary. I think even in here, in Coquitlam School District 43, which was one of the stories I featured in my documentary, that interview turned out to be very unhappy. Ended very unhappy. the school board representatives were kind of, what's the word? How would you describe that scene?
I think they felt deceived because he seemed very welcome when you came in.
Yeah, I think they took it for granted that because I obviously is a Chinese Canadian, so I think they took it for granted.
They just assumed you would be supporting.
I would be supportive
the CI.
because who would against the cultural program if you don't know what's behind that. That's true. So, and I also wanted to know what are the reasons they wanted to open a Confucius Institute in the first place. So I didn't say I'm just I cheated them. I know I don't think so. But once, of course, I wanted to also discuss those controversies. But it turned out nobody wants to talk about controversies at all. Once you ask that question, they will walk away. Of course, and even before the Coquitlam interview, I was doing interview with Brock University, which is near the Niagara Falls in Ontario. They have a Confucius Institute, and the Chinese Canadian directors happen to be two Chinese Canadian as well, but they are Brock's faculty. Okay. They represent Canada. And originally there were two filming. One, the first filming was just filming some B-rolls, and the second filming was another day to do interviews with a few universities, faculties, and the Confucius Institute representatives, and even their vice chancellor. But during the first filming, one of the two co-directors in Brock representing Canada, not the Chinese one, the Canadian. I keep emphasize that. One of the co-directors offered me some interview opportunities, and I asked him very mild questions. What did he thought of the closure of McMaster would in any way affect Brock's decision whether or not to continue its partnership with Confucius Institutes because of the discrimination.
Right.
And he said no, it would not affect in any way, and they're proud of their partnership with Confucius Institute, and that's it. Of course, I mentioned Falun Gong the name because that's it, right? Yeah. It's not like I like Falun Gong. I wanted to mention it, and because that's the fact. So of course I mentioned that name, but that became very sensitive to any Chinese, no matter you are Canadian or you are still Chinese. Yeah. No matter what your citizenship are, Falun Gong, a few words is very sensitive. So after that, my mild question in the first filming, I received an email from the Brock University asking me to sign on media consent, which provided few. I remember 6 conditions for me to continue the second day interviews. One of the 6 conditions was Brock University would have the rights to pre-screen any interview content, even if they gave me the interview. Like you did interview, I did interview with you, and I assume you could use anything. Unless we said beforehand, right? You can discuss with me, but they didn't say that, and they asked me the rights of Brock University to send to screen any interview content. If I want to use that part, but Brock isn't happy, and I could not use that. So I didn't sign that the media consent.
And I'm curious, what do you think is the motivation for most of the non-Chinese people supporting the Confucius Institute here? Is it because of money, or is it because they think it's actually a positive cultural program?
I think it depends. Of course, there are Westerners, non-Chinese Westerners. They like to learn Chinese language and culture, and they think, or they personally learned Chinese language and culture from Confucius Institutes. Their personal experience has been positive in that education, that language learning side. It's positive. I didn't disagree.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't disagree on that front.
Okay.
I think Confucius Institutes has been doing job in teaching Chinese language and culture, but culture side, it's not authentic Chinese culture, but I don't go that far to explain that front. So that's basically for some of the Westerners to support Confucius Institutes.
Mm-hmm.
But do we want to sacrifice or compromise our universal values to the learning of Chinese language? Is Confucius Institutes are the only options we could learn Chinese language and culture? I doubt it's not.
Yeah.
We have abundant of other options as well. But on this side, this is a pro side. But on the con side, each of the con side is not to be compromised. To me, human rights, academic freedom, or espionage and national security, each of them, you're not afford to compromise a bit. For me, I think I set a higher bar. Maybe for some people it's it's okay. We can talk Taiwan in this faculty, even though in Confucius Institutes we cannot.
Yeah.
But we can talk here anyway. But for me, it's not complete.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's if it's universal
It's a slippery
values,
slope,
right? It's universal. It means universal. You cannot say, oh, here is okay, here is not okay.
And
so
then 2 years from now, here is also not okay. And
yeah,
then it keeps going,
the bar
right?
keeps going lower and lower. That's why we have been seeing in the Western society, right? In this so-called engaging China policies, we're not the China doesn't become better country. Like human rights, the freedom of speech became worse.
Okay.
And not only that, didn't become good. And look at ourselves. We have more and more things compromised. It's not win-win. It's the opposite. It's lose-lose. So that's one, but we went far.
Yeah.
And the second situation for the Westerners to support is like this I just mentioned engaging China camp. After my visiting to German universities where they have Confucius Institutes last year, I am more convinced that there are a large group of China experts in the West countries, including Canada, United States, Germany, all the Western countries. There are a large number of people, Westerners, they know China well and way above average knowledge of average in general public. They should have, to me, I think they should have been helping China as a nation, helping Chinese people to fight for freedom, human rights, fight for those universal values. But instead, to me, they are more sympathetic to the Chinese government, or if sympathetic is not a good word, they are more understanding or more understandable of the Chinese government. So they say, we want to engage China. We need to interact with China anyway. So Confucius Institute, why not Confucius Institute?
I see.
And
like it's the easiest option out there.
Yeah, it's very convenient options, and also a very typical situation would be, let's make the good use of Confucius Institutes and eliminate or minimize the threats or risks Confucius Institute could bring to us. But that didn't happen based on my observation and research. Like I spoke with 3 German universities, Confucius Institute staffs, not staffs, they're like leaders or directors. They know about the discriminatory hiring policies. They know in order to open a Confucius Institute on their campus, they would not talk about those Taiwan, Tibet, Falun Gong, Tiananmen issue in their Confucius Institutes, but they accept.
Okay.
They said, we can discuss those issues at our sinology institutions, even though it's not happening in Confucius institutes. So the bar has been very low now.
Yeah, I see.
And when I suggest them, okay, if you don't want to close your Confucius institutes, then you can ask Hanban to remove that discriminatory clause, right? Once it's removed, and you have no burden of moral criticism, right? Yeah. And you have good reason to ask the Chinese partner to do so. And you see, they asked me what would be the consequence. Do you understand? I was kind of shocked by the question.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, right, it's a right question to ask the Chinese partner. It's also morally we are obliged to do so. But that person who asked the question was worried about what if China refused to remove that. So they are feared of losing the Chinese money, I think.
Yeah, I see. So yeah, it's a big part about money, right?
Yeah, so I think that's very typically the second group of Westerners who are supportive to the China's Confucius institutes.
Yeah. So my last question: have you been banned from entering China because of your work?
Yes, I was not allowed to going back to China even before I started to make this documentary, because back then I was doing some independent journalism and doing stories like the Toronto Tibet communities protest against the Chinese government, or Falun Gong practitioners in Toronto, and to tell their persecution experiences back in China.
And that was enough.
yeah, that was enough to for the Chinese government to not like me, to dislike. So I was rejected a visa, Chinese visa, to going back to visit my dying father that night.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that was kind of the price people like myself have to pay in order to speak out against the Chinese Communist government.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think I would like to people to walk away after watching my film to think about first, is the Confucius Institutes are needed here in Canada? And second, more broadly, through the Confucius Institutes, what kind of influence the Chinese government has been able to operate in our Canadian society? And even more broadly, outside of the Confucius Institute's box, what other fields the Chinese government has been able to influence us or infiltrate us, even more so. And it's dangerous if Canada doesn't rethink its China policy, if the current government is still so weak in terms of dealing the communist China. I worried about the future of Canada.
Okay.
I don't want to come to Canada with the communist China still following us.
Yeah.
I think that's the collective...
you came here to live in a free world.
Right. That's why back in 2014, the Chinese community in Toronto, they spoke out against the Confucius Institutes.
Okay. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we are having an event tomorrow at UBC, so thanks for watching, and please come to our event. And if you have any $1 or $2 to spare, please donate to our Patreon. And
I think the event is happening at the venue?
At Earth Science Building at UBC.
And 6:30
6:30 p.m. Yeah. Thank you.